Yo, what's shaking? Welcome back to another edition of Orange Bloods Texas Football on YouTube. I'm Geoff Ketchum. That's Anwar Richardson. Our sponsor today, Underdog Fantasy. Get your fantasy scratch on. Scratch that itch. Do that thing. If you want to play fantasy, whether it's daily, season long, whatever the case may be, they will match up to 100% of your deposit, your first deposit up to $100 if you use the Orange Bloods code. Check out Underdog Fantasy. Anwar, today we're talking about Big 12 running backs. We're talking about Bijan versus Deuce Vaughn. And I have to admit, when we were talking about ideas for a video earlier today, my initial reaction was, well, that's one-sided. I mean, of course everybody's going to take Bijan because Bijan's, I think, the hotter name on NFL draft boards. I think he's the former 5-star. And yet, when you look at the production from the two players, it's actually much closer than one might think. And you might actually be able to make a case that Deuce Vaughn, in a conversation of Big 12 running backs, should be first on the totem pole. I would personally take Bijan Robinson. And look, if you're watching this video, like it, subscribe to the channel, comment in the comment section on this conversation of Big 12 running backs. But once again, we go into a season where I think making first team all Big 12 running back is going to be quite the battle.
Yeah, and let's keep it a buck here, Catch. You are a Deuce Vaughn fan. Like, can we say that? I mean,
yeah, I mean, I like Deuce Vaughn. My whole thing is I think Deuce Vaughn is a spectacular college football player. And he's playing for a school in Kansas State. Look, if he's happy, I've never begrudged someone's happiness. I just think a guy that talented deserves a stage and a platform fitting of his talent. And in a world where the portal exists and guys can pick any place they want to go to, it would not have surprised me had that guy been like, I'm going to be like Jahmyr Gibbs and put my name into the portal and go to Alabama, or put my name into the portal and see what happens, a la Jordan Addison. So, you know, he's a phenomenal college football player that up until now continues to stick loyal to Kansas State. I don't begrudge that, but I'd love to see that guy playing at a college that allows for his career to mean something.
I mean, here's the thing about Deuce Vaughn is in the conversation, Catch. Last season, when you look at it, the dude rushed for 1,400 yards. 1,400 yards, 8 touchdowns. He also had 468 receptions for 4 touchdowns. So we're talking about 22 touchdowns for this guy. Nearly 2,000 yards of overall offense from a guy that, let's just be honest, Kansas doesn't have that many offensive weapons, right? I mean, it's pretty much Deuce Vaughn and a couple of other guys that you're just like, okay. And, you know, and decent quarterback, of course, last year that they had. So it's what Deuce Vaughn is able to do is very impressive. Like, it's one of the more impressive things to be able to do I think we're almost past the point of talking about his height, even though you have to factor in the guys like 5'6" and ain't that big. But what he's able to do, that elusiveness, low to the ground, hard to see, be able to hit the holes, knowing that, hey, this team doesn't have a lot of weapons. That's who they're going to rely on. And as the success that he has, yeah, like 2-point catch. Bijan gets all the names, gets the accolades. He's got the Lambo. It's sexy, first round pick. But if we're just speaking from a pure college standpoint, and you and I would probably still pick Bijan. But when we talk about putting respect on someone's name, man, I mean, Deuce Vaughn, talk about putting some respect on his name. You got to do that for that guy.
Yeah, I mean, Bijan is such a spectacular talent that if you forget about the stats and everything else for a second, and we're just doing an eyeball test. One guy looks like a future NFL. I mean, Bijan Robinson showed up day one in Austin looking like a guy that looks like a future NFL player. Deuce Vaughn is a smaller guy. Like you said, you're talking about a guy who's 5'6", 172 pounds, was so unspectacular as a prospect that nobody inside the state of Texas offered that kid a scholarship when he was a prospect. I mean, he's from Round Rock. He is right down the street. He's the son of a former Texas assistant coach. I mean, he's got his background suggests he should have been, I think more highly coveted coming out of high school than he was. He wasn't. And I think that if you're just doing the eyeball test, this is an easy one. It's you take Bijan and you move along. But the longer that you look at what they're doing in college right now, I mean, Deuce Vaughn makes a real compelling case. I think the thing that stands out for me is that he has a slightly better yards per carry. If we're talking about Deuce Vaughn versus Bijan last season averaged 5.8 yards per carry, whereas Deuce Vaughn averaged 6 yards per carry. Deuce, though, is a more high-volume player, certainly in the receiving game. A year ago, in a loss to Oklahoma where Kansas State loses 37-31, limited that day in the run game, 51 yards on 15 carries, but he caught 10 passes for 104 yards and a touchdown. And it's hard to overlook the fact that he had 9 100-yard games a year ago, even against the likes of Baylor late in the season when Baylor had it cooking. Vaughn averaged 11.6 yards per carry against a Baylor defense that, if I'm not mistaken, held Bijan to like 2.5 yards per carry. Now, you could go game by game, and I think there's some ebb and flow in terms of who had the better game against a certain particular team. It's just way closer than my instincts would have told me. My eyes tell me there's nothing to talk about, that it's Bijan Robinson all day. But the stats tell a little bit of a different story. And I think to that, you've got to give, Deuce Vaughn some credit. The fact that even in the bowl game last year against LSU, he drops 146 and 3 touchdowns. I think that was the game that got me in trouble with Kansas State fans, because after the LSU bowl game, that was when I was like, okay, this guy needs to go play somewhere spectacularly. If we talk about who do we think has the better season in 2022, it's really close. I mean, Bijan has to stay healthy. And that would be, towards the end of last season, Bijan Robinson was a guy that his workload started to tail off a little bit. And, Bijan doesn't go for 100 yards in any of his last 3 games of the season. So, I think that it'll be interesting to see kind of how this thing goes. Can Bijan handle the type of workload that a guy like Deuce Vaughn was able to put up last year? It's not insignificant that Deuce Vaughn had 40 more carries over the course of the season, and that comes along with catching nearly twice as many passes.
Yeah, catch. I mean, listen, I was looking at, as you're talking, the preseason all Big 12 teams. I noted they have 2 running backs that go there. For you, these are the top 2 in the conference, correct? I mean,
they would have to be. And a year ago, it was way more competitive because you had Breece Hall, who was, might have been the highest ranked running back in the draft last year. I know he went in the second round. I can't exactly remember the order of the running backs at this point. And then, Abram Smith at Baylor put up, Tristan Ebner from Baylor last year put up huge numbers. When you think about the running backs in the Big 12, there were 4 legitimate guys that were fighting for first team all Big 12 spots. Deuce Vaughn got the short end of the stick last year and ended up making second team all Big 12. This year, it feels like these 2 guys are the no doubt about it first team running backs. But if we're talking about who's the favorite for a Doak Walker Award or who's the favorite for first team All-America honors this year, it's a real close conversation. And the thing that you know about Deuce Vaughn is that Kansas State has no other choice but to give him, I think, a really heavy workload. The thing that we don't know about Texas with Bijan Robinson is how spread out and even will the distribution in this Texas offense be this year? We talk about it constantly, the number of mouths that they're going to want to feed, whether it's in the passing game or even at the running back position. There will be, as much as everybody loves Bijan, I think Roschon Johnson is a guy that they need to get carries. I think we'll constantly all season long talk about, can they get Keelan Robinson more carries? Is he a guy that you can get a half dozen carries per game? I wonder, when we talk about Bijan and Deuce in a heads-up battle to see who's going to be the best running back in the Big 12 this year, if Bijan will get the workload that might allow him to match what Deuce Vaughn will do. Deuce Vaughn had more carries, he had more yards, he had a better yards per carry, he had more touchdowns, and he had more receptions. I mean, he basically pitches a shutout in terms of the numbers you're looking at the running back position in a heads-up comparison. But a lot of that comes down to the fact that game in and game out, he's getting closer to 20+ carries per game than Bijan did a year ago. And I don't know if that changes in 2022.
Yeah, Ketchum. Bijan's around that. You looked it up. He's like 19.5 range. So he's around that 20 carry range. Like you said, Deuce is around that like 23 carry range. And there was that one game where Bijan had that 35 carries for 216 and two against TCU, where basically, carries the team in that day. So, but to the greater point, it's like Steve Sarkisian will want to run the ball, so we know Bijan will get there. But even when we talked about the Jordan Addison conversation, Catch, if you have Jordan Addison, Xavier Worthy, Isaiah Nayor, go down the list of guys that we're talking about, like at some point, you got to hope either you got a huge lead and then, you're just having Bijan just finish you off in the fourth quarter. But there will definitely be a lot of mouths to feed. It's interesting, Catch, it would have been interesting with the conversation that we had just put the numbers out there and had people guess who was who. I guarantee you the majority of people would have guessed those numbers were Bijan's. The higher numbers would have been Bijan's as opposed to, Deuce in there. You're right. The conversation ends up being a lot closer from a statistical standpoint, even though, like I said, Bijan's stud, looks great. I mean, just there's no questioning how his upside and how good is it. I mean, he's going to be in a conversation for the Heisman Catch. So we know that.
Is he though?
He'll be in the conversation.
Is he really though?
He'll be in the conversation. I mean, there'll be Heisman odds for him. So conversation. Now,
I don't think going into the season, I think Bijan as a Heisman candidate is way overcooked. And I don't know that Bijan's the best player in his own offense.
Well, I mean, if he finished with 1,200 yards, almost 1,200 last season, 1,102, and that's in 10 games. If he ups it, Catch, I mean, I don't think, 1,500 rushing yards is totally off the table. I don't think nearly 2,000, overall yards would be off the table with here. I think that would, it maybe, and to your point, maybe you're saying Doak Walker, right? But I'm not saying it would be there at the end of the season, because for that to happen, the team has to have a lot of success, right? So this needs to be a 9-win team or something like that, especially at the running back position. But I think when we're talking about that going into that Alabama game, people will say, hey, Texas has got Bijan. He's a guy that's been talked about for, as a potential Heisman candidate. I just mean like in that vein, as opposed to the guy I expect to be in New York in December. That's all I mean.
I don't worry about this, right? It's nothing to worry about. But when we talk about Bijan achieving something historically good, I don't know that I just don't know that. I just did the math a second ago. 195 carries divided by 12. He averaged 16, I think, 0.25 carries per game, which is only a couple less than Deuce Vaughn.
No, he played. He missed 2 games because of injury. Catch. He played in 10 games last year.
Oh, that's right.
John had that one strong game. towards the
No,
end.
you're exactly right. Okay, you're right. I did the math wrong. Well, at the end of the day, I still wonder if the workload will be there to allow him to, I don't know if he's got, could he do 1,500 yards? Yes. And I primarily think that because of his sheer talent alone. But if we start talking about going north of that, I don't know. He's just not in a one-man offense. There's so many other guys in this offense that from week to week, I think will take some of the love. There will be games where the passing game really leads the way for the Longhorns, or they split it up and Roschon has a big game, or, I think it's going to be a little bit more spread out. Whereas when you think about Deuce Vaughn and the offense that he's going to be in this year, they lose Skylar Thompson, who ends up being an NFL draft choice. And, who would have thought that? They replaced him with Adrian Martinez from Nebraska. They are going to be a heavy run offense this year at Kansas State. And I think we'll probably, if he had 235 carries last season, I wouldn't be surprised if when we see Deuce Vaughn at the end of the season, he's north of 250, maybe even close to 270, that we're talking about a guy that's getting between 22 and 24 carries per game. We'll see. Like I think Deuce Vaughn's in a better situation to put up bigger numbers because I think week in and week out, they're going to have to lean on him. I do also think it's interesting that both of these guys had stretches during the season last year, like month-long stretches where their workload was in the case of Deuce Vaughn, from the middle of October, from the middle of September, he had a 13-carry game and a loss to Oklahoma State, a 15-carry loss in a game against Oklahoma that they lost, an 18-carry game against Iowa State where they lost, and then a 15-carry game in Lubbock where they win by a point, and he just wasn't really heavily involved. And then you look at the rest of the season and you see, for the most part, when they're getting him the ball 20-plus carries a game, that's when Kansas State was at their best this season. I mean, to that point, even looking at the Texas game at the end of the year, 24 carries for 143 yards, they basically put the game on his shoulders, and that kept them in the game. I wonder if Bijan will be leaned on to that extent, although there were moments last year where the same thing kind of happened to Bijan, specifically down the stretch, right? You mentioned that 35-carry game against TCU. When Texas needed Bijan Robinson to carry a heavier workload, Sark wasn't opposed to giving him that. But week in and week out, his carries, I mean, only 4 times last year did he go north of 20. He had 20 in the season opener. He had 35 against TCU, but then only 20 against Oklahoma, 21 against Oklahoma State, and that was it. So for him to go nuclear, they actually have to, I think, give him the ball more often this year than they did a year ago. And I don't know. I don't know what my confidence level is that Bijan's going to be a guy that averages north of 20 carries per game. They don't want to abuse him and put him in a position where his NFL stock decreases because they rode him like the Cowboys did to Marco Murray when Murray was about to be a free agent. And it was like, oh, well, we only have him for one more year. Might as well just run his ass off. I think Sarkisian's going to protect Bijan more than that. And that protection will be for his good, but it might be for his detriment with regards to the types of honors he'll be in a position to win at the end of the season.
Do you think by any chance, I wanted to look this up for a point of a comparison, like, do you think you don't see, I'm trying to see what like Najee Harris had, in his 2020 season. Let me see if I can look that up real quick, because I'm trying to see, do you think it would be something similar to that performance?
That's so. I mean, that Alabama offense was loaded with so many NFL guys. Without even looking at the numbers.
Let me tell you what Najee had in 2020. Okay. 251. Okay. 1,466 yards, golly, 26 rushing TDs, also 425 with 4 touchdowns.
In the passing game.
Yes,
I
425.
don't think Bijan's going to hit those heights.
Okay.
I think Bijan's headed for 1,400 yards, 20 touchdowns. I mean, it's not light years of a difference. I think the touchdown numbers stood out to me. Like, I don't know that Bijan's going to hit. He had 11 last year. If you just had told me not to look at stat lines and asked me to guess how many touchdowns in the ground game Bijan had a year ago. He had 4 catching the ball, right? I would have probably said like 20. In my head, the number would have been inflated. And in reality, he averages basically a touchdown a game on the ground. That's now, the other thing Najee Harris has going for him is that he got to play in 14 games. So, and those extra carries, that's what happens when you play in a playoff game. And he actually played in 15 games, right? You're talking about an SEC championship game, a playoff game, and then a national championship game. That's how his numbers get inflated really beyond the point. If you take those 3 games away, Najee Harris's numbers look very much like Bijan's numbers from a year ago, except for the volume of touchdowns that Najee Harris was able to get, over the course of an 11 or 12 game season. I think, this is real first world problems here in college football. Which of these badass running backs has the best chance of winning the Doak Walker Award? They're both candidates. My last thought on this video will just continue to come down to, I don't know if Bijan gets the volume that would allow for him to be named the nation's best running back. Even if from a talent standpoint, we look at him and say, well, there's nobody else we would prefer to take. I think there will be other running backs that have a chance to post bigger numbers.
Yeah, so it looks like that 2020 catch was a COVID year. It looks like, so they played 13 games that season, and because as I was going through the year, their first game was on September 26th.
So how many carries did you say again?
So he finished with 251.
251 divided by 13.
So it could have potentially been even more now that we think about it with a couple of more games.
His numbers per game, again, without the touchdowns, pretty even to what Bijan did a year ago.
Yeah.
Those extra games, it actually evens out better for us when we're comparing Najee versus the Najee Harris senior or last season under Sarkisian with what Bijan did a year ago. Because Bijan did play in 10 games, it actually makes for an easier apple-to-apple side-by-side comparison because he had those extra 3 games. If you take those away, the carries per game are right in that sweet spot that Bijan was a year ago. Yeah, I mean, I think he can have that type of season. Not quite sure about the number of touchdowns. And I wonder what 1,400 yards and 20 touchdowns looks like against the field in college football, where there'll be some guys that are 1,800, 1,900 yards playing in a completely different situation than Bijan. It'll be apples to oranges in terms of rolling the offense. And a lot of this comes down to Quinn Ewers, man. If Quinn Ewers is the guy that we think he can be, and this passing game for the Longhorns picks up, it does alleviate a lot of the weight on Bijan's shoulders. Of the guys in this conversation, specifically Deuce Vaughn and him heads up, one guy has an enormous amount of weight, I think, that he has to carry from week to week on his shoulders. We're talking about with Bijan, can he get 6-man boxes? Because the Texas passing game might put so much stress, especially in a world where Jordan Addison joins the fray. It's like suddenly you've got so much firepower at the wide receiver position. You know what? Maybe that opens the door for Bijan to maybe not have the huge volume, but boy, there aren't going to be many games this season where Deuce Vaughn's running against 6 in the box. Yeah, Texas, might be in a position where that happens more frequently. Again, even if Bijan's the guy that every team comes in saying, we have to make sure that guy doesn't go off. When you got a team full of guys that can go off, you can only focus on stopping one guy so often before you look up and Xavier Worthy's got 12 catches for 200 yards. And you're like, hey, well, we stopped Bijan and they still scored 40 points. So just a different dynamic that Bijan lives in with his supporting cast, I think, than what we would look at with Kansas State right now.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, Catch. The last thing I'll say on it is that I think if you're a Kansas State fan who's watched it, you could probably talk yourself into Deuce, over Bijan. I think because you could go look at the numbers and say, hey, look, this is what he's done. Stack boxes, not as many, 5 stars around him. Look what this guy's able to do under these circumstances. You could probably talk yourself into it. Like I said, we'll vote for Bijan, but it's probably a little bit closer than you and I anticipated upon the onset of the conversation.
Oh, if you're a Kansas State fan, you can absolutely talk yourself into it. He had more yards, better yards per carry, more touchdowns, and he was a bigger threat in the receiving game. And he was more durable a year ago. It is, I think, if you ask me, final thought, and I'm curious, I'm curious to see what the comments section looks like this in a Deuce versus Bijan conversation. Deuce, up until now, has proven to be a more durable college football player. Bijan hasn't had any major injuries, but he has had a couple of injuries, both as a freshman and as a sophomore, that led to him playing in fewer games than, the schedule allowed for him to participate in. What does it look like this year? Bijan Robinson playing a full 12 games without getting nicked up in a way that causes him to either miss games or, have to take a lesser workload in the name of protecting his body, I think is a big thing that NFL teams will want to keep an eye on. If you are looking to spend a first-round pick on a running back, the durability question is a big one. So that's as much as anything else. If Bijan Robinson can stay healthy and play a full 12-game schedule, it opens up a lot of doors for him in these conversations that we're having. If he can't, he has no chance, right? If he misses a couple of games again as a junior, it's hard to imagine a world where a 10-game running back, unless he's truly posting spectacular numbers, is going to get a first-team All-American nod. So he comes into the season, I think, with the biggest rep of any running back in the country, and everybody's got them on their NFL watch list. That's half the battle. Durability, and then I think volume may define just how high he climbs up the awards list when the season comes to an end. Look, fascinating conversation. Leave your comments in the comments section. Do Anwar and I a favor. It's not my birthday today. It was yesterday. But I'll still take some birthday likes and some birthday subscriptions to the channel. If you're brand new, we do this basically every day of the week. Videos every day, some of them live, some of them recorded, always bringing you the content, trying to make it as compelling as possible. Do us a solid. Do those things. Leave your comments in the comments section for myself and Anwar Richardson. And Underdog Fantasy, the sponsor of today's show, let them give you $100 for free. I mean, it's kind of that simple. Let them give you $100. For myself and Anwar Richardson, we'll talk to you tomorrow. Later.